Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. Should you upgrade the graphics card on your older FX-based computer system, or is it time to replace it with a completely new machine, or at least a new CPU? That's what we're going to take a look at today. This is my FX 8300 based build that I previously did on the channel, running at 4 GHz on all the cores. We have an HD 7970 3GB graphics card. This is a 6-year-old graphics card, and it's the gigahertz edition. It was, if not top of the line, very close to it 6 years ago when it came out. Same thing with the FX chips, which also came out around the same time frame. 16 gigabytes of DDR3 system RAM, 1080p, and in this case, high detail in Grand Theft Auto 5. Now, I want to make something very clear before we talk about performance. This is completely, totally playable. It is very smooth, and we're getting around 60 frames per second at high detail 1080p. So if you have an FX-based system, and frankly, it could be an FX 6300 as well as an 8300. If it's at 4 gigahertz, that's a cool jump. It'll be roughly the same performance. Notice on that jump, we're almost 100 frames per second, but it doesn't hold that most of it. We're going to go split screen here in a second, and the rest of this video is going to be split screen, but I want to give you a chance before we do that so that you can see that regardless of charts and benchmark numbers and bottlenecks and whether it's worth upgrading or not, I would like to point out that GTA 5 plays very, very well at 1080p high detail, even if the 1070 Ti will be faster, which of course it will be. It's new and expensive and fancy. We are using MSI Afterburner to produce the real-time numbers in the upper left-hand corner, and Fraps was used for the benchmark chart that you'll see in just a minute. Now we've gone split screen. The computers are identical in all respects except the graphics card. You can see we have a GTX 1070 Ti. Currently, in my opinion, one of the best values for a high-end gaming card. It's about $500, give or take a little bit. You can find them for just a touch under that these days. 8 gigabytes of VRAM. It is nearly triple the graphics performance of an HD 7970, so it should be triple the frame rate, right? Well, that depends. If we're not CPU bottlenecked, if we're totally GPU bottlenecked, yes, it will be much faster, be running in the hundreds of frames per second. Take a look at the bottom half of your screen. Are we running even double the frame rate of the HD 7970? Are we running even 50% faster? Well, we are at times, depending upon where in the world that we are, but not really, because we are in fact CPU bound. If you own an FX-based processor, you may find putting a new graphics card doesn't really make much of a difference. Now, we are playing at 1080p detail. It is absolutely true that if you want to play at 1440p or 4K, then yes, you would see a much larger difference in performance here. But it's also worth noting that the HD 7970 would really struggle at 1440p and would be completely worthless at 4K. So making a comparison there doesn't really work because I can't show you those settings on the HD 7970 because it's just, you're down in the 20 to 30 frames per second. It's choppy, it's uneven. The 1% lows are down in the teens, and it's just a horrible experience. So don't even waste your time. So instead, I'm showing you 1080p, which is the much more common resolution. And the gist of it is, no, you're not likely to see a big difference going to a GTX 1070 Ti at 1080p. Now, this is not going to be true if you get a new CPU, and this is such an important distinction. If you upgrade to, say, a Ryzen 7 2700X or an i7 8700K with the GTX 1070 Ti, you will see a larger performance benefit. You'll see a much larger gap in performance. But we are in fact CPU bottlenecked here. The FX 8300, even at 4 gigahertz overclock, is what's holding us back. Take a look at the first percentage of the GPU utilization of both cards. We're at about 50% on the HD 7970, and we're at 28, there's 32% on the 1070 Ti. The 1070 Ti, the clock speed keeps dropping as well. It's currently running about 1800, but it drops down to 1200 several times because it basically has nothing to do. It is totally and completely bottlenecked by the FX 8300 at 1080p high detail. Now here's the benchmark results from the run. I actually played the game on both systems much, much longer than this, but I'm keeping it short to keep the video short and sweet. 58 frames per second average on the HD 7970 versus 74 on the GTX 1070 Ti. Now, immediately some people are going to say, but clearly it's faster. Yeah, but you're going to go spend $500 on a graphics card for a, what, 20, 25 FPS jump? It's worth noting that the 1% low barely budged, 41 to 45. The reason the average is higher is because of the tops, not the bottoms. The 1070 Ti doesn't lift the bottoms, it lifts the tops. During moments where there's not much going on and the CPU's not busy, it does get into several hundred frames per second, which the HD 7970 doesn't do. But it doesn't really fix the busy areas, and it simply increases the gap between the top and bottom performance numbers, whereas the 7970 is more consistent with its performance. You're really not getting much with the 1070 Ti. Notice also that the 0.1% lows are down in the 30s. That's all CPU bottlenecking there. Get a modern CPU, you won't have that problem. Next up, we have Overwatch 1080p high detail preset on both of them. I've gone straight to split screen. This is extremely self-explanatory. Look at the usage of each of the cards. The HD 7970 is running at about 100%. We are fully taxed to capacity, or just about, on the HD 7970. The GTX 1070 Ti is loafing along at 50 to 60%. It's CPU bottlenecked. Yes, it's running a bit faster on it, and it does run a bit faster. Certainly the peaks are much higher, which will drag the averages up, but the minimums and the 1% low and the 0.1% low aren't that different. For smooth playable frame rates, the FX 8300 is a good CPU. If it's what I had and I was very budget limited, there's nothing wrong with it. Would I stick a GTX 1070 Ti in it? No, I think it's complete overkill. If you want an upgrade, a GTX 1060 is reasonable. You can currently get the 6GB version of the GTX 1060 in the $250 to $300 range, and I think it's a better value if you aren't going to upgrade your CPU in the near future. On the other hand, if you're going, but I want a new graphics card because I'm going to get a new CPU in the next 6 months to a year, I'm going to wait for the new 8-core Intels, I want Ryzen 3, I'll get one, I just can't afford to do everything at once. Fair enough. There's nothing wrong with putting a GTX 1070 Ti in it. Just keep in mind that at 1080p you aren't getting all the value for your money until you also upgrade your CPU. Now this chart looks very much like GTA 5 did, 120 to 138 frames per second. Yes, absolutely, the GTX 1070 Ti is in fact faster in the average. But I'd like to point out that 120 frames per second is ridiculously playable in Overwatch, and this is at high detail, so frankly, you don't need an upgrade at all. If this is the sort of game you play, if you play Overwatch, League of Legends, CSGO, Dota 2, you don't need an upgrade. A 6-year-old CPU, a 6-year-old graphics card is frankly just fine at 1080p. You might want it if you're going to 1440p or 4K, but for this, you're just fine. I would like to point out once again, the 1% low and the 0.1% low show virtually no difference. The reason it's higher at average is because the peaks are higher, but the playable levels of the lows are not, because we are CPU bottlenecked where it really counts when everything is going on the screen and there's explosions and killing and rockets. Next up, we have World of Warships, and a quick note, I'm pleased to announce that I am now a World of Warships Wargaming community contributor. Basically, this means that I will get advanced access to ships, I'll be able to do ship reviews and have them come out on launch day. It gives me some cool stuff to give away to you each month on my Twitch live streams, links down in the description below. You'll find the link to both my Twitch channel and my wife. My wife goes by the name of Roguestorm on Twitch, and she also plays World of Warships, so you'll catch both of us streaming together and then also apart. In any case, World of Warships is fairly easy to play on modest hardware. There's no need for an upgrade here whatsoever at 1080p. Frankly, even at 1440p, that HD 7970 would do just fine. Why am I including it? It's one of my favorite games, and a lot of people like to play it. This sort of game, World of Tanks, World of Warships, War Thunder, these are very popular free-to-play games, and they really don't need that good of hardware to play. You can't play them on Intel integrated graphics very well. They will, but not very. But a 6-year-old CPU and a 6-year-old graphics card, so long as it was top of the line 6 years ago, actually does a great job. Okay, now don't laugh. The HD 7970 actually won here, but that's because they're different battles. I'm playing actual battles, not doing a fixed built-in benchmark, and because of that, what occurred during each battle is going to vary. Take all these benchmark charts with a grain of salt. Because of the fact that I'm doing open world live gameplay, they're all going to vary by a bit. You don't want to look at one and go, well, that's 69 and that's 64, therefore it must be better. No, they're within 5 frames per second. You'll never notice 5 frames per second in the real world anyway, unless we're talking like 10 to 15. At 69 to 64, it doesn't make a difference. The truth of the matter is both of these games are completely bottlenecked by the CPU, but they're both over 60 frames per second, and it is in fact completely playable on an FX 8300. I would like to point out this game only uses 2 cores. An FX 6300, an FX 4300. So long as you're running at 4 gigahertz, wouldn't make any difference, it'd play exactly the same. This is a bit of a different test. This is the Division 1080p high detail on the GTX 1070 Ti, 1080p low detail on the HD 7970. Let me be absolutely clear, the detail on the top of the screen is low, the detail on the bottom of the screen is high. This is important because when you look at the graphics card utilization and the frame rates, it won't make sense until you take that into account, and I'll show that on the chart in a second. The reason I did this is because playing this at 1080p low on a GTX 1070 is just ridiculous. But I tried the Division at 1080p high on the HD 7970, and believe it or not, it falls apart really fast. It's rough. It'll do it, but it's rough, and so actually I decided to split it and show that one of the things you can do by spending a bunch of money on a graphics card is way up the detail level. I kept it the same resolution, but you can go from low to high and get comparable performance. Now, you could also get, well, not comparable performance, but over 60 frames per second with a GTX 1060. You don't have to buy a 1070 Ti, but this just shows what's possible. Or the 1070 Ti would do 1440p high detail at roughly 60 frames per second if you'd rather have 1440p as an upgrade, still on the FX 8300. Look at the CPU utilization, especially on the 1070 Ti. It's using 70 to 81%. We're using 6+ cores. In fact, it's using 7 of the cores on the FX 8300. An FX 4300 would not be doing this. A 6300 would be really pushing it. We have left behind the days of AAA games being just 4-core, 4-thread, not needing 8 cores, not needing 8 threads. And this game here is 2 years old. The Division 2 is coming out next year. So if you want to play AAA games such as this, the days of the 4-core, 4-thread chips, frankly, are over. But this is an 8-thread chip. The FX 8300 still has life left in it. If you're okay with the performance you see here, this is an old CPU that is very smooth and very playable. 113 frames per second on the HD 7970, remember low detail. 104 frames per second average on the 1070 Ti, remember high detail. With the 1% low numbers, we have 72 and 64, and then 53 and 48 on the 0.1% low. The last game we're looking at is Ghost Recon Wildlands, 1080p low detail on both tests. The top and the bottom are both low detail. I will show you in a minute high detail on the GTX 1070 Ti to show you a comparison between the two, and I've got both charts. But for now, we're doing comparable detail levels low on both of them. Notice that the graphics card utilization of the HD 7970 is at 99%. We are actually bottlenecked at low detail at 1080p on the 7970 rather than CPU bound. This is the first benchmark in this video that actually shows this. Ghost Recon Wildlands is kind of the Crysis of this generation. For those of you who remember 10 years ago, can it run Crysis? Now it's can it run Ghost Recon Wildlands? This is the only game out of 5 games I'm showing you that is actually going to show a noticeable difference, which is why I'm showing you both low and high on the GTX 1070 Ti, because it really does make a difference. On the 1070 Ti on the bottom, notice the graphics card utilization is bouncing between 55 and 60%. Versus the 99% up top. Notice the frame rate's higher. There's 82, there's 83. Now we are in fact in different parts of the map, so you can't compare them frame by frame, but you can watch this for a minute or two and get a general idea of the performance. Notice there's trees and vegetations on both sides. I actually tested about 15 minutes give or take on both of them. When you're doing these live gameplay tests, you can't just test them for 2 or 3 minutes. I mean, you can, but the problem is you might catch an area of the game that is not reflective of overall performance. play it for 15 minutes, chase down a couple of convoys, drive around to different parts of the map, and you're going to get a truer representation of performance. It's not perfect. You'd have to really be methodical about exactly where you went to try to make it copied and probably do it for longer. My effort here is to make a best effort to get within 95% of whatever the true number would be if I went to ridiculous lengths to do proper benchmarking. Now, this game does in fact have a built-in benchmark, but that built-in benchmark does not put CPU demand the same way playing the game does. It's just a graphics card test. It's not a CPU test. You've really got to play the game to see the CPU stressed. Look on the bottom at the FX 8300. We're touching 90%. Ghost Recon Wildlands will absolutely use 8 threads. It will use more than 8 threads. Put this on a Ryzen 7, you will see the CPU usage over 50%. Since it's a 16-thread processor, anything over 50% is over 8 threads. You'll see it in the 10 to 11, sometimes 12 thread range. A Ryzen 5 2600 or 2600X absolutely can see 80 to 90% CPU usage. And this game is already a year old. I understand a lot of people think, well, you don't really need all these cores and threads. Ryzen 7s are a waste of money. The new upcoming 8-core Intel is a waste of money for gaming. I don't think so. I think if you want a CPU to last you for the next 5 years the way some of these have, I think you should absolutely buy an 8-core 16-thread CPU. You can buy a 6-core 12-thread, but I think the 8-core is a wiser long-term investment. Unlike all the other charts I've shown you, 54 to 85 frames per second is not a small jump in performance. It's not double, it's not triple, but it is a respectable jump in performance. 38 to 55 on the 1% low is also a very respectable jump, and even 28 to 36 is not an insignificant jump at the 0.1% low. The GTX 1070 Ti would be notably faster on a more modern CPU. We are still being held back by the FX 8300, but not as much as all the other tests. So, if you want to see these numbers go higher, if you want to see over 100 frames per second on the GTX 1070 Ti, which it absolutely can do in Ghost Recon Wildlands, in fact, we should be in the 130s, 100 and maybe low 140s at 1080p low detail. If you had an Intel i7 8700K at 5 gigahertz, you might be double these performance numbers. So we are being held back, but it is still a notable performance improvement. Now let me show you high detail. The top of your screen is high detail 1080p. The bottom of your screen is low detail 1080p. You can tell by the real-time performance numbers in the mid-70s on the top versus the 90s on the bottom, so higher detail is going to have lower performance. But it's not a huge drop-off. If you try to do high detail on that HD 7970, it's unplayable. It is absolutely atrocious. I did try it. It is awful. But on the 1070 Ti, it is not a huge performance deficit. It is a performance deficit, but not a huge one. Now here's what's interesting. We are still a little bit CPU bound on the GTX 1070 Ti, even at 1080p high detail. Notice it's only in the 81-82% range on the top versus in the 50s on the bottom. Yes, now if we had this CPU up at 4.5 gigahertz, it would be better. If we could get it to 5 gigahertz, it'd make a difference. The truth of the matter is, a Ryzen 5 2600X or a Ryzen 7 2700X at 4 gigahertz would remove all that CPU bottleneck. You would absolutely have that GTX 1070 Ti at max performance. It would be at 99%, because while the clock speed would be the same at 4 gigahertz, the instructions per clock cycle on the Ryzen are a dramatic improvement over the FX 8300. I'd like to point out that they're both above 60 frames per second playable, although the high detail does dip down from time to time, and you'll see this reflected in the GPU utilization. That's because the CPU is completely, there's 93%, 93, 90%. The CPU is overtasked. It simply can't keep up with what's going on. It's very playable. You can buy a GTX 1070 Ti, go to 1080p, high detail, and it will be very playable. But you would also get very similar performance numbers using a 6GB GTX 1060 to what you're seeing here. It would not be as fast, but it would be close. So that's kind of a personal choice. If you're planning on upgrading your CPU, I said this earlier in the video, if you are planning on upgrading your CPU in the next year and you don't want to have to replace your graphics card in the next year, then by all means, go ahead and get a 1070 Ti or even a 1080 if you want. It will be bottlenecked by your FX 8300, but you'll replace it and you'll be just fine. If you plan to keep your CPU for the next 2-3 years, this graphics card's a complete waste. It really is. Buy something like a 1060, buy an RX 580, which is roughly the same performance, and you'll get better value for your money on an FX 8300. And here's the chart showing low versus high detail on the 1070 Ti. You go from 85 frames per second to 72. You don't lose a lot of performance. You lose a little bit, of course, but you don't lose a lot, even though the graphic detail is a massive improvement because the graphics card was bored at low detail. It simply was a waste of a graphics card at low detail. So the 1070 Ti lets you turn up the details, get good performance, even if maybe a bit overkill. The lows are worth pointing out. The 1% and 0.1% low are both below 60 frames per second, regardless of detail. The CPU is the limit. The FX 8300 is absolutely holding down the lows and creates an uneven performance in this game. It really wants a better processor. It'll do it, but it wants a better one. Now for my closing thoughts, I'm going to take the low detail play away and just show you this game in its glorious high detail 1080p beauty on the GTX 1070 Ti. As I said, it's a great value for the money, just maybe not on this CPU. I really do think a Ryzen 7 2700X, or frankly even a Ryzen 7 1700 overclocked to 3.7 gigahertz would be fine for it. An i7 8700K would also be fine. I would not buy a Ryzen 5 or an i5 if you can all afford it. I understand budgets are an issue, and maybe a Ryzen 5 1600 or a Ryzen 5 2600 is more within your budget. I can appreciate that. I would not buy an i5 8400 or even an 8600K. Yes, they can be, the 8600K can be overclocked. Yes, I understand it has higher IPC. You would be replacing an 8-thread chip with a 6-thread chip. I think you'd be really sorry in 18 months that you did that. You'd get very little future life out of it before you'd suddenly run into the constraints of a lack of threads. But it's your money, you do what you want. But I really do think either an i7 or a Ryzen 7 is the best pairing for a roughly $500 graphics card, or buy something down a bit. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with the big huge red button directly below. Questions and comments in the comment section, please check the links in the video description. Links to all of the parts, the graphics cards, the CPUs, everything I've talked about here will be down in the video description below. As I said before, the FX 8300 you're seeing here is a build I did on my channel. You can check it out. I wouldn't build one at this point. In fact, I probably won't even link to it because even if it's cheap, even if you can buy the processor for $75, I wouldn't buy one at this point because you got to buy a motherboard, you got to buy DDR3 RAM, and this is absolutely end of life at this point. It really is showing its limitations. If you own one, I understand. But I would not go out and buy one, not even cheap, not even secondhand, unless maybe it's your only computer and your other option is nothing. But to be completely honest, I would take a Ryzen 5 2400G 4-core 8-thread chip over an FX 8300. It would be a better overall experience. In any case, thanks so much for watching. I will see all of you next time.